Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for being here with me. So you are the head of ecosystems at CARMERA, which is a street intelligence system that specializes in high-definition mapping for autonomous cars.
That's right. Yeah.
So CARMERA takes a very people-first approach to safety, and is very proactive in data transparency. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I'd love to. So hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm Jessie, and I run ecosystem business development at CARMERA. And so I think the way you described the company is perfect. We're a street level intelligence company for autonomous vehicles. But I'm a non-technical person, and the way that I say that is we build maps for machines. And so one of the ways, and one of the things we found in building these maps, and I can get into how we do it and why it's important, and really a key enabling technology for autonomous vehicle deployments. But one of the things that we found in the process of building these maps and in engaging with all of the stakeholders in the AV ecosystem is that maps can serve as this amazing nexus to provide data transparency without sacrificing competition. It can make sure that these deployments are done in an equitable and safe way without sacrificing innovation, and can really be like one of the most important ways that we can figure out how to make autonomous deployments work for all people in cities as dense and complex and crazy as New York. So that's why I'm so excited to work there and so excited to talk about just autonomy and the future of mobility tonight.
Yeah, amazing. So does that mean that we should expect autonomous cars here in New York City anytime soon?
How did you all get here tonight? Did you take the subway? Did anyone have any delays on the subway? No? Oh, yes, okay.
I did.
Yeah, I know. So listen, I'm a New York evangelist. I am really a long-term better on public transit and believe it's always going to be the most efficient and the best way to get around the cities. I think that autonomous vehicles in New York are still a ways away. But when they get here, they have tremendous potential to unlock underserved communities and underserved transit areas. The price points on these things are going to be so much lower. It's going to create a huge amount of consumer surplus in terms of mobility for people. So there's that. But right now, we are live in a few really interesting use cases, and I think that the use case for autonomy is going to evolve. And before it gets into the 5 boroughs or into the dense, complicated sort of urban environments like New York, we're seeing them in retirement villages, like self-contained communities. So the network effects of these mobility systems, people are just staying within the village. We're live in this retirement community in Florida called The Villages. We call it taking away the keys but not the freedom. And we have, we're partnering with an autonomous vehicle startup called Voyage. And we're providing autonomous taxi service, we're providing the map for autonomous taxi service all over their community. It's 750 miles of roads and almost 150,000 people who have demand for this. So the use cases are evolving, and I think that once we get to sort of a steady state of autonomy, New York will be on the later side of that adoption curve for sure.
Oh, what a shame. I was expecting to see autonomous vehicles with bicycles and scooters all at the same time.
All the modes, and ferries too, you know. We've got every mode choice in New York.
Are there any key areas where you see accelerated development here domestically or globally, actually?
Yeah, well, so I mentioned this deployment in Florida, and I think you'll see a few more of those start to bubble up. Another place where we are live is in Michigan, and if it's okay, I'd love to talk a little bit about why the map is so important.
Absolutely.
Because honestly, Michigan is, I think, one of the most interesting places because the weather changes all the time. I mean, it's not like Florida, where it's endless sunshine. But so the maps help the cars know where they need to be within centimeters of precision. if you think about the way that, like when I'm reading Waze and trying to sort of bark directions at my husband who's driving sometimes, like I'm interpreting this information and then looking at the world and making decisions within, you know, a radius of meters. But a machine doesn't really have that same ability to observe the world around it and ingest all the information within meters. It needs centimeters. So the first reason these maps are super important is because it tells them where they should be in the lane within centimeters. And if you're driving in Michigan and it's snowing and the lane line is covered with snow, the car won't know where to go. So that's a very important reason that maps matter. And the other thing we're testing, and this is happening in some of our deployments, is that maps help cars respond to changes in street level conditions. So changes meaning a bike lane has been added that the car didn't know was there, but the current base map it's using thinks that there's a bike lane there. Or there's new construction here. Or this is a really dense pedestrian area between 12 and 12:10 on Tuesdays. And so should I or should I not drive down that part of the city? So the maps are helping these cars become more intelligent about the world that they might encounter, but they can't necessarily see, if that makes sense. So if there's a lot of, it's sort of Waze for machines. It's a hyper-precise next generation Waze is I think another way to talk about it.
Have there been any incidences that affected this in a negative way or that caused concern?
Yeah, so I think we've seen, unfortunately, we've read some stories about some of the AI that has not functioned properly. And one of the things that maps can do is add a very important layer of redundancy. So one of the examples I think you might be talking about happened in the West, and the car looked at something that it thought was a bridge, but it was an 18-wheeler. It was a big truck, and it tried to drive across it. And so if it had been using a map, it would have known there's not a bridge there. So what you're seeing is not actually what you think you're seeing is not actually what you're seeing. And so adding as many layers of redundancy and sort of those critical safety elements into these deployments will be key.
So when we're talking about economic development, how can companies like yours and governments work together to move this forward?
So I love talking about the role of government in all of this. And part of that is because I used to work in government. Before this role, I was the chief digital officer for New York City. And that really is a bit of a misnomer because a huge part of my job was being sort of the ombudsman to the tech community and making sure that the regulations and the regulatory frameworks that the city of New York is applying to tech companies and their business models is actually relevant. And in that role, a big challenge that I faced, and I think that we faced in City Hall, in terms of developing responsive regulatory frameworks, was the lack of data. I think that the smart policymakers know that you really don't make policy in a vacuum or based on a sort of finger in the wind, based on some sort of hunch. You need a fact base to support it. And so I think that the promise, not just for autonomous vehicles, but for the entire tech ecosystem and all of these, I hate the word, but disrupted, all of these sort of new modes of transit that are coming onto the city, using the public right-of-way, public spaces, roads, sidewalks, curb space. There's a price to all of this, and government really needs to understand what that price is and how it should be regulated and harnessed for the sort of equitable and for all the reasons of equity and the public good. So with that long preamble, I think that something that excites me about CARMERA is that, as I mentioned, the maps, the data that's generated by generating the maps, the data that comes from the maps has tremendous value to policymakers, to folks who are now sitting where I sat a few years ago thinking about, all right, I don't know what the sources of congestion in the Manhattan core are, but I'd love some data to help me figure that out. And so the way that we keep our maps live and dynamic and living and up to date is through computer vision algorithms on fleets driving around the city, sort of categorizing things, and then noticing. Part of the algorithm is noticing when things have changed. So we can make sure that there's a real-time sort of stream of information about construction has started on this block. There's a new bike lane on this block, or this stop sign wasn't there yesterday and it's here today. And so it's a way of giving policymakers just an additional tool in the toolbox to make smarter decisions. And I really think that as a Made in New York City company, it's really back to our first principles to be a respectful steward of the government that regulates us here.
So, in your opinion, what is a well-behaved startup in this space?
I think that you're implying there are not well-behaved startups, but I'm sure we don't know any of those. Listen, so yeah, I think Dawn may be right, but there's a really important ethos to tech in New York. It's like we're kind of all living in this place together, and it's dense and it's funky and it's gritty, and we love that. And so I think the people who work in these companies and then the problems we're all trying to solve are sort of urban improvements in their nature and at their core. And so when I think about what is a well-behaved startup in transportation or in urban tech, I think about a few things. The first is I think that you have to realize what externalities and what positive and negative you're potentially creating. And then you need to figure out how you can proactively and respectfully engage government to help them solve public policy challenges that the data you're creating might assist them in doing. And so those two things sometimes go hand in hand, but really on the latter, I think that even if government is not your customer, and it is not our customer, we do not sell our product to government. We sell our product to automotive companies, we sell it to autonomous vehicle startups, like that's our core customer. But we've found that the data that our core customers need and the data that we create by building a product that our core customers love has value to government. And so even if this has nothing to do with autonomous vehicles, like we're pointing out where there's construction happening on the street, there aren't autonomous vehicles in New York, and New York is going to be, as I think we've discussed, one of the later places for these deployments. But we've been very proactive and have started a few partnerships. One we're working towards with the New York City Department of Transportation to provide this information in real time. And I think that you're starting to see the sort of maturation of the tech ecosystem when it comes to the role of government, and realizing that government actually is a really important part of validating your product so that consumers trust it and will use it.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes left. Should we take some questions? Do we have questions from the audience? Yeah.
Hi. I think you might have touched on this briefly, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the role of like ethics and the trolley problem and the idea that sometimes autonomous vehicles have to choose if there's a situation where there's an accident, and what would the role of maps play in something like that?
Yeah. So I think that's a really important question, and something that maps aren't necessarily directly involved in. I think that a lot of these questions arise when the vehicles themselves and the intelligence and the algorithms in those vehicles. But I will say that what maps can do is that they can be a very important safeguard for modular deployments for these cars. So let's talk about a public policy goal in New York City, Vision Zero. Are you familiar with this? It's basically the city's big initiative to make sure that pedestrian traffic fatalities stop, full stop. And one of the things that our map can do is pay attention to, in a way that the city hasn't built the kind of fact base, and policymakers are continuously looking for data sources, can build a fact base that can say, all right, this area in this part of the city, this intersection at this particular time of day is not safe for vehicles. And so the map can sort of remove that area as a zone of potential travel for a vehicle, and make it pedestrian first. So I think that there are a lot of ways that maps can really service the goals of safety as well.
Do you have time for one more question? Yeah. Gentleman over here.
So you mentioned that the way you gather your data is by having fleets driving around. I just was wondering, could you go into that a little bit more in more depth, like how frequently are those fleets driving around, and how do you manage for things like rural areas that's not a dense, bustling city? Like, is it the same time frame, things like that?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question, and this is part of our product that I get really excited about. But so yeah, we partner with different fleet companies. We have a few logistics companies you might know of, other kinds of fleets that are mostly in cities. We just closed our Series B, and so I do believe that expanding the coverage to outside of sort of dense urban core is on the horizon. But right now we're partnering with mostly city-based fleets. We have just sort of an Android camera that we've mounted on top of their car, so it's not like in the cab. And it's just a computer vision algorithm that's sort of classifying, driving around, noting sort of what's going on the street, like what's happening, and then, as I said, mapping it back to a source of truth and figuring out what's changed. But we have pretty great coverage in a lot of the cities where we are. I mean, it's amazing the sort of refresh rates that many of these fleets can provide, and that's what keeps our maps really up to date, dynamic, and living. We're pushing a lot of that processing to the edge, so we're not like storing any of this data, or that's sort of the longer term view. But I think that the fleet product and this sort of dynamic like ways for machines is a really exciting development, both for autonomy but also for improving just real-time intelligence in our uses today.
Thank you so much. Another round of applause for Silvia.
Thank you.
And for Jessie, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great.